Okay, so today what I'm doing is continuing my efforts to get to know the Fractal FM3 Mark II that my friend lent to me. And if you're not someone who's watched any of my previous videos, my background is mostly in using the Neural DSP Quad Cortex. And I feel like I know that device pretty well. I'm new to the Fractal world. I'm not in here to try to do any kind of real in-depth comparison here. I'm still learning about Fractal and how to get around and make presets. And I'm sure there's a lot of Fractal users that are kind of cringing at some of the mistakes I make. I know in the last video I did, there was a lot of folks who found it very painful to watch me kind of fumble around with some of the pitch shifters, and I'm sure they're yelling at the screen, use the capo, use the capo. But anyway, what I wanted to do today was to look at some of the high gain amps within the devices. This is something that someone had requested in the comments of the last video. I thought it was a good kind of test case to use, and again, to get to know the Fractal better and maybe, compare and contrast it with what the QC does. So let's go through this Fractal preset real quick. So obviously we've got our inputs and our outputs. On the back end, I've got a medium hall reverb, mixes at 20%. So not a lot of reverb, just a little bit of ambience on the back end. I don't want to overdo it. From a cab standpoint, I'm using two IRs that I loaded, and I did this not because I think they're the best cabinets for this comparison, but because I wanted to be able to use the same IRs on both the Quad Cortex and the Fractal so that we get a kind of apples to apples, so to speak, and we're only hearing the differences in the amps, not in the different cab and IR settings. You can see here I've got the high cut on at 7,500, so just a little bit of top end rolled off. In front of that, got a few pedals I want to try out on some of these amps. One is a tube screamer, drives at 2, levels at 7, and then we've got a rat, drives at 1.5, levels at 8. So again, we're just using this for a little bit of tone shaping and to push the front of these amps. Let's talk about the amps. So on this, I've got 4 scenes set up. One's got a Friedman HPE. One's got a Soldano 100 lead. One's got a Marshall JVM, and I'm using the OD2 orange. And then one's got a 5153, which I'm assuming is the EVH 5150. And we're using the 100 watt red. So again, just trying some of the high gain amps. And let me pause here to talk about what I mean by high gain. And you notice here I actually call it higher gain. High gain can mean a lot of things to different people. And to me, when I think high gain, I'm thinking, John Petrucci and Dream Theater, maybe a little bit of what Intervals does with Aaron Marshall and those kinds of things. So I know there's a lot of people when they think high gain, think a lot more higher gain than that. But for me, that's what it means. And so I'm looking at, amps that are kind of playing in that range, and we're not going into like super high gain metal kind of sounds. That's just not what I do. For this demo, I'm using my Schecter AM6, which is the new Aaron Marshall signature guitar. So this is a dual humbucker guitar. Humbuckers aren't super hot. They are pretty bright, and they have a lot of definition to them. I think they do well here. So let's get into how this preset sounds. So we'll start on scene 1, which is our Friedman. You can see here we've got the gain about half, rolling off some bass, a little bit of mid, pushing the treble a little bit, but otherwise we're basically on noon. And let's hear what it sounds like. So a nice gainy sound, not too thick. If we kick it on the front with the tube screamer, so that fills in the mids a little bit, give it a little bit of a push. Let's hear it with the rat. The rat has that kind of top end bite to it, a lot of definition. This is kind of a trick that I know Nuno Betancourt uses a lot. So that works pretty well. Let's go check out the Friedman on the Quad Cortex. Okay, so here we are on the Quad Cortex. You can see we have a very similar preset here. We've got our reverb on the end, the Hall reverb mixed at 20%. We've got our IRs here, our Marshall and our orange, with our low pass at 7,500. On the front end, we've got the tube screamer and the rat. We've got those assigned to these stomps. I'm in hybrid mode. I've got scenes across the top with the 4 amps, and then we've got stomps for each pedal. And then we've got our Friedman, our Soldano, our Marshall, and our EVH. I'm not sure the Marshall and EVH models line up perfectly with the models that we have on the Fractal, but I think they're close enough. So let's go ahead, and the first thing I want to talk about is CPU usage a little bit here. So one thing I like about the Fractal is, if you notice on the Fractal, we had one block for the amp. And that's all you can have on the FM3. You can't do multiple amp blocks on an FM3. But you can have multiple, what they call channels, which allows you to switch what amp models in that block. On the Quad Cortex, you have to have separate amp blocks for each amp. And what that means is the Quad Cortex is going to reserve CPU for every one of these amps on the crazy chance that you're going to want to use all 4 amps at the same time. And I like the fact the Fractal, through the channels, you can switch between amps without having to reserve enough CPU for all 4 amps at once. And so that's one thing I like, that I wish Quad Cortex would maybe learn from that a little bit. And I wish there was a way we could have different amp models kind of within one block so that we didn't have to reserve all this CPU for all 4 of these amp models in our CPU usage. So, but let's hear how the Friedman sounds. So here it is without the pedals in front. So pretty similar to the Fractal. I think maybe the Fractal has a little more gain to it, but they're pretty close. So if I turn this on, Tube Screamer. Works as expected. Let's try the rat. So let's switch back to the Fractal, and so we can maybe get some back-to-back. So here's the amp on its own. Here's the Fractal. So pretty similar. Again, I think the Fractal maybe has a little more gain on it, but not a lot. I mean, maybe this 5 is like 4.5 on the Quad Cortex, but they're pretty close. So let's switch to look at the Soldano. And while we're doing that, let's talk about that concept of channels. So you can see here, for each scene, for each block, you can choose a channel. And if you notice, I've got each scene using a different channel for the amp block. And so what that does, it allows you to use the same block to load in different types based on what channel you pick. But it's not having to reserve the CPU to run all 4 amps at the same time. You notice the CPU up here is a little over half, which was kind of where the Quad Cortex was. I think it was at 49%. So the FM3 has much less processing power than the Quad Cortex, but because it does this aspect of loading these amps just as channels, it's not requiring it to reserve all the CPU for all 4 amps at once. And the FM3 won't even run multiple amps at the same time, right? You can only run 1 amp type at a time. But because of this channel capability, it allows you a lot of flexibility for how you use that amp block. So just something to keep in mind. Let's hear the Soldano. Let's hit it with the tube screamer. The tube screamer does really well with the Soldano. The Soldano has a very kind of a scoop sound to it, in my mind. So I like how the tube screamer kind of fills in some of that mid. Let's try the Rat. The Soldano doesn't really need the Rat that much. The Rat works really well in kind of tightening up the bottom end, but the Soldano bottom end is already really tight, so I don't know you really need it. But the tube screamer. So let's move on to our Brit. So again, I'm using the JVM OD2 Orange. Gains a little less than half. Pulling back the mids a little bit, a little more treble. See what that sounds like. Here, I don't think this model has as much gain to it as the one on the Fractal. So I'm not sure that it's a good like-for-like comparison, but let's go with it anyway. So the 5153, so this is, I'm assuming, a 5150. So I've got gain at halfway, pulling back the mids just a little bit, pulling back the master volume a little bit, and see what it sounds like. Hit with our these drives don't do much in front of this amp. Back to the Fractal. So I hope you found this helpful in some way. My goal here is just to myself, I'm just trying to learn the Fractal device, and I figured kind of watching me maybe fumble through it and make a few mistakes might help you avoid some of those things. And maybe learn differences between the devices in case you want to think about, maybe dipping your toe into a Fractal or to a Quad Cortex. In the meantime, if there's any other features that you'd like me to compare between the two, I'm happy to do it. And I'm always looking for ideas for, ways to learn more about the two devices. So just let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.